We are on.
Well, it's time for the Inside Blitz, everybody. Welcome back. Ron Ace is here. Las Vegas Chris isn't. And we are joined today by Sharp Clark, a.k.a. Josiah. Great to have you with us, sir, and all the way from Europe and your days there. Tell us a little bit about you and your gambling and NFL background.
Yeah, so I've been, watching and casually betting for a couple decades now. But about 3 years ago, I dove into this question. How can you measure a team's performance in a given game? Because if you could objectify that into a number across every NFL game, then I think you'd have a better sense of the quality of every team, and I think you could then use that to identify where a team performs, below or above expectation, and what kind of circumstances lead to that. So I developed a way to basically evaluate a team's effectiveness on offense and the other team's effectiveness on offense, which then translates to a defensive effectiveness. And I watch every snap of every NFL game, and I try to mute out the sort of random events that impact stats and impact final scores, and instead replace it with this numerical value that represents what I call effectiveness. And so a good example of this is I went back and looked at some of the games from 2021, and there was a game where the Chargers beat the Bengals 41-22. And I actually graded the Bengals as the more effective team in that game. So they lost by 19 points, and they were the more effective team. And so the things that were factored out in my process were things like there was one play, it was 1st and 10 on the Bengals 29, and Joe Burrow has all the time in the world. Jamar Chase burns his man. He throws a bullet down the sideline directly in the breadbasket, and Jamar Chase bobbles it. The defender catches up and intercepts the ball. Now, 9 times out of 10, that's a touchdown. And the other 10% of the time, he's catching it and getting tackled, or maybe he drops it. But the interception was such a crazy random event that has such a huge impact on the game, right? Yep. There was also a Joe Mixon fumble that was returned for a touchdown. Those types of things are not repeatable, and so they end up not factoring into my effectiveness grade. And so that's my methodology, is I create these numbers, and then I use those numbers, in my reviews over the course of the season to identify who's outperforming, what people think. And then I try to find the delta between my numbers and advanced statistical metrics like EPA per play to try to identify where even the sharpest people who are using statistics are getting it wrong. And so that's my analytical approach.
Okay, so are you looking for anything specifically, or is it just depending on the game and what happens, and there are highlights within a game that stand out that absolutely just dominate your numbers?
No, so it's every single play. And what I'm trying to evaluate is how effective is this offense at accomplishing its goal? Okay, so on most drives, that's scoring a touchdown, right? But not every drive. You get the ball, with 30 seconds left on your own 20. If you get a field goal on that drive, that's pretty damn effective, right?
Yeah.
And so everything is contextual based. Or like at the end of the game, let's say you've got a 6-point lead and there's 8 minutes left. If you drive down and don't give the other team the ball once, that's an extremely effective drive in that circumstance, especially if the team knows that you're running and you can still run on them. So it's all circumstantial, it's all situational, and it's all drive by drive. And so, it just totally depends. And then, drives where it's like kneel downs, those don't factor in at all. Things like, skill position play or fumbles, like a receiver makes a catch for first down and fumbles. Those aren't typically predictable of any future events. And so those don't really make it into my analysis. And then things like, it's 3rd and 15 and you get sacked, and then there's a roughing the passer penalty that gives you a first down. Offense doesn't get any credit for that. In fact, the defense gets a ton of credit for that drive. So things like that.
That's great.
So you take this information, and then what's your takeaway from that? How does it help you with the next week's game?
So I'm looking, it basically gives me a number that I use instead of final score to evaluate teams. Okay. So for example, coming off that Bengals Chargers game, I was of the opinion that the Chargers had played a good game. And so I was sort of backing the Chargers as people the Bengals. I was backing the Bengals as people were fading them because they were like, look, they lost by 19 points to the Chargers. And on the flip side, I'm like, well, the Chargers may not be quite as good as people think coming out of this game because they see the scoreboard and get excited about the 41-22 win. So it's all about finding the difference between what I evaluate as true effectiveness versus the perception of bettors and sportsbooks and the public.
So did you immediately bet the Bengals to win the Super Bowl after that game?
No, but I did a few weeks later bet the Bengals to win the AFC at 9-1.
Really?
Yeah.
That's beautiful.
Yeah. So, we were on together, and this is where we first kind of discovered each other. Midway through the season, we did mid-season evaluations of every single team, NFC and AFC. And I remember at the time we were both talking about Kansas City, who sat at about 4-4 with a -9 turnover ratio, and how we were saying this isn't going to continue. We've discussed this. I've discussed this numerous times about their offensive line was all new and so on and so forth. What were your impressions at that point, if you could recall, Kansas City, and were you surprised or not surprised as to the fact that they rallied and won the division?
So I was not surprised. Their offense never was a problem for me. I mean, they weren't as effective as they were a few years ago. I think they had some issues with some of the defenses they faced, but overall it was a lot of fluky things, like you were saying. Like I was saying, receivers hit in the hands and bobbling up for an interception, receivers catching and fumbling, running backs fumbling. These types of things aren't typically predictive. So I wasn't worried about the offense. The defense was terrible in those first 4 to 6 games.
Yep.
And so I was like, well, they could be better. They've been using Chris Jones at a different position. Tyrann Mathieu's been hurt. There's reasons to expect them to get a little bit better, but I didn't expect them to get significantly better, which I think they did. I think they played fairly well, especially in the middle of the season on defense. And that was a bit of a surprise.
So what about from a number standpoint? How do you lay it out? Like just for the average person out there, what is the number? Is it a number like if it would been a 7-point favorite one day, in your mind, they're only a 4-point favorite? I mean, how do you give us an example of that?
Yeah, so I have, using the historical data that I've collected, I can translate my effectiveness ratings into projected point differentials. Okay. And so my effectiveness ratings scale from 1 to 10. And so typical, most scores are somewhere between 4 and 6. There are some outliers. And typically 1 point on my effectiveness ratings measures to about 7 or 8 points on the spread. So if I project one team to be one whole effectiveness rating level higher than another, on a neutral field, they'll be about a 7 or 8 point favorite. And so I've written these computer programs that use formulas to sort of, indicate variance and percentage of winning and spreads and stuff like that. So it's very complicated, but the computer does the work for me now.
Is this strictly your baby, or did you learn this from anybody else?
100% my work.
Wow, that's phenomenal. Perfect. Have you heard of this, Ron, before? Ron, are you familiar with anything similar to this at all?
No, I mean, it's people like us where we're just hidden from view. There's probably hundreds of people like us that are doing this, but they're under the radar because we're in an analytics world right now. I mean, every team is using analytics like they've never done before. And we're trying to get an edge, something that we see that clicks. I'm putting words in your mouth, but basically, this is what we're looking for, something that somebody else isn't doing, taking the same analytics and coming up with a different decision.
Fascinating stuff.
So one of the things you've been doing, and we've seen it, we've seen some tweets and we've seen a lot of research from you, is taking a look back at the season and what you've discovered, and maybe go into your process as to what you're doing now that it's the quote unquote off season, and how you're evaluating these teams, how you're taking that information, moving it towards projected wins and some of the advanced bets that you're making. And then we'll talk about maybe one or two of the teams, but talk about what you're looking at right now.
Great. So what I'm doing is I spend 3 days on each team. As soon as the offseason starts, I'm focused on what happened in 2021. So I'm not really, I'm paying attention to what happens in the free agent market, but I'm not trying to incorporate it into projections at this point. My first step is I spend a few months saying what really happened in 2021, because if you don't start from the correct understanding, then you're not going to end at the correct understanding once you've incorporated all the changes. And the changes aren't going to go anywhere. You'll still have time to incorporate them closer to the season, especially after the draft. So what I do is I use those numbers I was telling you about, and I show, performance relative to quality of opposing defenses, basically. And then on the other side, defensive performance relative to opposing offenses. And I identify under what kinds of circumstances teams were better or worse than you would think they would be. And sometimes it's obvious. You say, well, the Packers had a bad game when Aaron Rodgers didn't play. Okay, great. You don't learn much from that. But what you do learn is you start to see what types of defenses cause them the most issues, what kinds of defenses were a good matchup for that team. And you start to pick up on these patterns and these archetypes of teams. And so that's just a lot of, looking at charts, looking at numbers, looking at statistics, and putting that all together and identifying patterns. And I think that's something that I've always been drawn to. The way my brain works is it's very much pattern identifying. And so over the course of these seasons, I identify types of teams and I see it play out. And then sometimes those sort of understandings are confirmed. And then sometimes I have to revisit them and say, what did I miss here? What do I need to learn? Because I'm always evolving. And so that's kind of what I'm doing each year, is spending time with each team, the entire schedule, every performance, and seeing what I can learn from it.
Can you give us an example also of your success over the last few years, how that's turned into exactly what you wanted it to do?
Yeah, so in 2020, I did one NFL pick'em contest, and I picked 70% against the spread, and I came first, and that was
Nice.
That was great. Last year, I did a few, but there was one that was my solo primary entry, and that was in the Super Contest, and I was only 55%, so not in the money. But I look at those 2 years, and I say if 70% and 55% is kind of my range, at least over a short sample, then I have reason to be optimistic about the future. So
Absolutely.
yeah,
That's great.
So give us an example of one of the teams. I know you're maybe not even halfway through, but one of the teams that you looked at and it either changed your perspective or you said, well, wait a second, this is interesting.
Yeah, so I'm going to go back to the Bengals, actually. So the Bengals made a very fortunate playoff run. We all know there was a lot of luck involved. Even in the Super Bowl, they were lucky OBJ got hurt. I think they probably don't almost win that game if OBJ doesn't get hurt. The Chiefs game, a lot of luck. He got sacked 9 times against the Titans and they still won. These types of things are things that I expected to look at and say, well, I'm going to fade the Bengals. The public was way, way too high on the Bengals. But when I looked at my numbers and I looked at the progression of the season, I factored out the Week 18 game against Cleveland because they didn't play their starters. And they actually improved over the course of the season significantly. Sure. Even though they suffered injuries late, they overcame those injuries. They did the right things well. They passed the ball effectively, efficiently. They didn't run well, but that's not indicative of long-term success in the NFL. Passing is. And so I saw Joe Burrow's processing speed improve over the course of the season. Like, he still has a lot to learn, but all of these signs were pointing up. Jamar Chase was a rookie. By the end of the season, he's no longer a rookie. He's not playing like a rookie. And their biggest weakness, their only weakness really, was the offensive line. And so they went out and grabbed 3 really good offensive linemen, and importantly, linemen from really good offensive lines, right? Dallas, New England, and Tampa Bay, 3 of the best offensive lines in the league. So these are guys that understand chemistry and how the offensive line works. And so I'm picturing the Bengals addressing their biggest weakness and noticing that they were on the way up and saying, you know what, I'm not actually down on this team. I think this team does the right things well. Their aggressiveness in the passing game increased as they grew more comfortable in Burrow. And I think they're on the way up. And what we saw last year was the beginning of an upturn, not a fluky run.
Yeah, I'm wondering if you saw the same thing I saw that we talked about in previous shows here, with Joe Burrow progressing throughout the year of learning, I've got to get rid of the ball fast. That, the short stuff, the over the middle, I'm not holding this ball more than 3 seconds because I'm going to be smashed. And I thought by the end of the year, he had it down to perfection. And that was one of the keys to their success.
Definitely. And the way he handled the blitz, I think, is more indicative of long-term success at the quarterback position. You think of the really, really good quarterbacks, and they punish defenses that overcommit defenders on the blitz, right? And Burrow did that. Yep. So I think with an improved offensive line, if the teams aren't able to blitz, I mean, he's going to have all day, and he's an extremely accurate passer. And you've got 2 of the best receivers on the outside. I think this is a team that is a team to watch next year.
It's still an arrow up, don't you think, Ron? You know, how many times did I say from the playoffs after the Super Bowl, it's the worst offensive line in the history of the Super Bowl, and yet they were still there, and yet they still had a chance. So, wow, you had three guys like they did. That's got to help a lot.
Josiah mentioned a couple of things that are so incredibly important to winning and losing. I mean, there's a fine line, as we saw in the playoffs, between winning and losing. You mentioned the term chemistry, and you mentioned the term accuracy. Quarterback accuracy is incredibly important in the NFL, throwing into tight windows, throwing receivers open, and Joe Burrow has all of that. And chemistry, and this team hasn't had it for years and years. All the penalties, all the dysfunction, to see them actually play with one another, even without the three offensive linemen they've added right now, and how much better it could be. Now, there's going to be some obstacles that we haven't looked at yet in terms of the schedule bump up and so on and so forth, and expectations bump up. But I agree, they are definitely one of the teams on the right track. Any other team that you want to mention at this point before we move on?
The other thing I want to mention is more of a so my studies are twofold. One is to understand each and every team's true performance in 2021. The other thing that I'm doing is I'm identifying sort of bigger picture trends or types of teams that I can then apply to other teams in the future. And so what I've noticed is that my offensive grades have a much wider range than my defensive grades. And what this means is that offenses are typically more controlling of performance than defenses are in the NFL right now. And so, for example, the Chiefs in 2020 were plus 1.12, and the Jets in 2020 were minus 1.1 on offense. That was their average relative to opponent. On defense, the widest gaps I've seen are negative 0.6 and plus 0.65. And so they're just tightly grouped. And so what that means is that if we can identify teams whose defenses were overrated because they played against poor opponents, then we might be able to predict future defensive regression. And so I did this last year with Washington. Okay, they were my 10th ranked defense. And even that 10th ranking, this is in 2020, even that 10th ranking was overrated because they played against a bunch of teams' backups quarterbacks. They played Ben DiNucci, they played Finley on the Bengals. And so even with those backups, they were still only 10th in the NFL. And yet going into 2021, they were one of the most hyped defenses in the NFL. People were saying second best defense, third best defense. And I was saying, no, they're average at best. And so I faded Washington. And this year, I was like, well, who's that this year, right? And so I looked at the Patriots, and the Patriots were my 17th ranked defense on the season. Wow. And yet most people think they're top 5. And it's because, once again, they played against really bad teams. They played, I think, 5 playoff teams, and 3 of those were the Bills. And one of those was in terrible weather, and they didn't stop Josh Allen. The wind stopped Josh Allen. In the other 2 games, he destroyed them. And so, to me, the Patriots are that team that doesn't have a great offense, but needed their defense to play well to win, and now it's going to flip to face a much more difficult projected schedule. So wow. I think the Patriots defense is going to be disappointing, and I think they're a team that I'm not looking at back going into 2022.
And wondering if Coach Belichick is listening right now, and that's how he's going to draft coming up, right?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's very interesting and some excellent points made there. I missed the Washington fade bandwagon. Not that I like them, but those were excellent points about how they were overvalued. And if we can do this kind of analytics to find the next overvalued and undervalued team, that's the purpose of all the work that we're doing. And you mentioned something that morphs us right into the next topic. This is an offensive-minded league. The rules are offensive-minded. The quarterback play is changing. So I'm going to read you a quote that started all this, in terms of getting you on the show. And it was by Mike Tomlin. Quarterback mobility is a more significant part of the game than it's ever been in today's game. Matter of fact, in 2021, I think the yards per rush in the NFL was the largest it had ever been. It wasn't because teams are running the ball more effectively. And those who have seen my work, I've charted running data. I've charted all data, but running data over the last 27 years. And 2019 and 2020, I haven't done 2021 yet. was an incredible spike in terms of yards per carry in the NFL, yet the average number of yards per game did not change. This was all about quarterbacks.
Yep.
So you guys have opinions on that. Ted, Chris, and I, we talked about that on a previous show, and Josiah, you've talked about that. So why don't you start? Talk about the predictability of this new era of running quarterbacks and why maybe there's a caution sign involved in it.
Yeah, so this is such a nuanced topic that it's difficult to address quickly, but I think there's two ways of looking at it. And I think you have to look at it in both the short term and the long term. And in the short term, and I also think it's important to distinguish between mobile quarterbacks and running quarterbacks, because a quarterback like Patrick Mahomes is a mobile quarterback. He's very mobile. I think that the mobility of Patrick Mahomes allows him to reach a level of play that we've never seen before. But then there's a difference between that and a running quarterback where the offense is built around zone reads, designed quarterback runs, and it's a very run-focused offense. The primary example would be the Ravens. The Eagles also do it with Jalen Hurts. And so I think with running quarterbacks in the short term, it raises the floor of your team's performance. There aren't many examples of a good running quarterback where their offense just stinks. They're always able to do something. And that's because you're basically in the run game, you're playing 11 on 11 instead of 10 on 11. When a pocket quarterback hands the ball off, he leaves the play. Okay, now you've got 10 guys going up 11 defenders, you're going to be at a disadvantage. But if you include the quarterback in the play, whether it's a zone read, QB option, those kinds of things, you're now playing 11 on 11 football and you have an advantage. That's going to increase your rushing efficiency, whether you hand it off or whether you keep the ball. The result of that is then defenders have to come closer to the line of scrimmage. Linebackers can't cheat off in coverage. And so then the passing game becomes easier because the defense is focused on stopping the run. Receivers are going to have less coverage. And so that makes it easier to pass the ball, right? So you become a better passing and running team by having a running quarterback. But the problem is long-term, we haven't seen it be a path to long-term success in the NFL. And maybe Lamar Jackson is a unicorn. Maybe he changes that. But I don't think so. And here's why. When you're a pocket quarterback, your primary job is to read the defense. You have to read the coverages, understand how your wide receiver routes and tight end routes and running back routes interact with the defense, right? You think, okay, this guy is going to cheat over there. I'm going to have a slant open right here. And then you run the play and you run it. And sometimes you make a mistake. Sometimes you're wrong, but you learn. The problem with passing the ball on so few, designed pass plays is you don't learn those types of mechanics. You don't learn how to read the defense as much as someone who's back there throwing it all day. So I think that's one thing that you miss out a little bit when you're running the ball a ton is you're missing out on those intellectual opportunities to progress as a quarterback in the NFL. And so, Lamar Jackson can still get there and these running quarterbacks can still get there. But they've got to work on it. They've got to work on it harder because they're not doing it as often.
Well, I agree with everything there. And I think there's a couple of other ways of looking at it. You talk about defenses that are guessing a lot differently with a running quarterback than a passing quarterback. And I think they can cheat in different ways because they're not afraid of this guy beating them with the pass as much. And most of the time, those guys, when they come out of college, they're not able to read defenses like the other guys. Part of what you said. So I think that all comes into play in the pros. Now, after a couple of years, the question is, how much better do you get at it? Well, how much better can you get if you don't give yourself the opportunity to read those defense when you're thinking more, what am I going to do to get loose as opposed to get rid of the ball and find somebody open? So I think there's, a couple of different nuances there. The other thing is, major part of this is the injury factor. Okay. If Lamar Jackson finally got hurt, where most of us, and if you're paying attention, you expect it to happen eventually. Now the question is longevity. How much can he do this and for how long? And the same thing of Jalen Hurts is a kid, right? Kyler Murray's a small guy. How much can he literally do that until the pounding takes its effect and he can't do it anymore? Does he have a 15-year career? I seriously doubt it. It just can't happen. He's too small. He's not durable enough. And you can't just keep running into a brick wall and find out that everything is just fine. So I think that's a major thing when you're looking at drafting a young guy. Is he durable? For example, Josh Allen is not a running quarterback, but he can run, and he loves to run when he gets that opportunity, and he certainly has done it in the playoffs because they're giving him that chance, right? Has he beaten the overs every time on the ground game as far as in the playoffs, right? He has no. There's an opening, he's going for it, and he can run right through you. But he's not looking to do that. And the guys that are looking to do that, they are limited. They are limited by reading the defense, and they are limited by potentially getting hurt and really hurting your team, because whoever is your backup is not expected to do what you can do. And that now your offense is also, this is another thing, your offense is not geared to most of your backups. Your backups are not the running quarterback that the starters. That really screws up your team. So there's a big deal when you put, like when Harbaugh said that Lamar's our guy and we're going with him for the long haul. That is a major difference than most teams. You put your entire organization on his shoulders and say, please don't get hurt. That's a big gamble.
Josh Allen is a success story because he was an inaccurate college quarterback and a one-read guy who would prefer to run when things got tough. And to his credit and to Buffalo's credit, they surrounded him with the tools to succeed. Offensive line, better tight end, drafted a couple of running backs, traded for Diggs and so on and so forth. And he learned how to trust his arm more than just one read and go. And that's the evolution that all these guys they have to do, because the toothpaste is out of the tube right now, because we are going to more of a, like it or not, the league has evolved to more of a running style quarterback. And it helps, the great point about you play 11 on 11 when you have a quarterback that has some mobility. This is a red zone factor now that you have to account for the quarterback. You can't just sit there and not have a spy on the quarterback or not. There's a whole new playbook on 3rd and goal from the 5-yard line that there never was before. And so it's a great thing for the NFL. I think something Chris brought up in a previous podcast as well is that these quarterbacks are being trained to do this more even before college. They're learning how to use their legs, their arm, and so on. They're still, to Josiah's point, not going to be able to read the full field because they've not been asked to read the full field as they progress. But somewhere down their line, they're going to have to read the full field.
And the question are they capable of doing that? Because if they've never done it before, you're not coming to the NFL to learn. You should know by the time you get there. That's an issue.
Yeah, and I'll add a couple points. One is that a lot of the discourse on this topic completely misses the point. People say like Lamar Jackson can't throw. He can throw. He's got arm talent. Like, that is not the issue. The issue is, you look at Aaron Rodgers, okay, and he is manipulating the defense with his eyes because he knows the defensive assignments. He knows, where they're going to go. He tries to get them to go somewhere else. Mahomes does this. Matthew Stafford does this. Those are the types of skills that you need to have in order to be an elite passing quarterback. And so can Lamar Jackson throw the ball? Absolutely. And does it help when Marquise Brown burns his man and he's able to escape the pocket and throw it downfield? Like, those are great plays. But he's not going to be able to make it to that next level, the top level, unless he learns those really sort of complex defensive reading skills. It's not about his throwing talent. And then the second thing I want to point out is using my game ratings, I've been able to identify under what circumstances these offenses succeed and when they fail. And it's actually a paradoxical result so far. You'd think that they would do well against teams that can't stop the run because they're a run-heavy team. But it's actually the reverse. These teams typically have their best games against teams who are stronger against the run than the pass. Because they're to succeed, they still need to be able to pass. It's very, very, very rare that you can just run all day and win the game, right? You have to be able to run to set up the pass. And so their biggest struggles, Baltimore's biggest struggles, Philadelphia's biggest struggles this year, were the teams that had a high passing defense efficiency. Because when they needed that 3rd and 7, when they didn't quite get those yards on 1st and 2nd down, they just could not handle the really good pass defense, and that stopped them. So I think, and that's a big deal in the playoffs. We've seen passing efficiency be key to winning Super Bowls.
I want to bring up one more real quick point on the running quarterback. And Josiah, you brought up a great example on a couple of guys. Russell Wilson is another one who at the beginning of his career, he ran around a lot more, and now he's just a slider. He just finds a little opening, boom, he slides, he's done. That's fine. I'm not going to get hit, and he's smart. But here's a guy who can read the defenses too, though, obviously. Homework for everybody under the age of 50, including you, Sharp Clark. Spend 10 minutes, go online, Google Fran Tarkenton, and watch the scrambler that he was. He rarely got hurt when he got hit. And that's a really important thing for a lot of these guys that are so used to running. You also need to avoid the big hits. And some of them don't know how to do it. And you know what? Your careers, you're going to lose millions. And you're also going to kill your organization too.
Yeah. There's a reason why running back longevity is typically much shorter than quarterback longevity. And it's the types of hits you're taking. And, Brady's playing till 45. You'll never see a running back play till 45.
It's going to be interesting. And we're not really getting into the draft now, but I'm going to read you some stats of the 5 highest rated quarterbacks coming into this year's draft. Okay. And the question that's going to be on everybody's minds, our minds for sure, is are they a running quarterback or are they running right now to establish the pass and to be able to read defenses down the road? So Kenny Pickett, 809 rushing yards in his career, 20 rushing touchdowns. That's more than what used to be, but it's just average right now. And he uses his legs a lot more in his senior year than he did previously. So you could see he's evolved, but he's the closest to a pocket passer we have of the 5. Malik Willis, he ran for 1,812 yards the last 2 years. He's a one-read quarterback right now. He throws high. There's a lot of flaws to his passing game. Everybody knows he's going to need some time. But right now, he's more in the I'm going to run first category and the new wave of quarterbacks. Matt Corral, one of the games I studied, he ran the ball 29 times. Running backs don't run the ball 29 times, certainly not in the NFL. He had 1,120 yards the last 2 years, 11 rushing touchdowns alone last year, which brings a skill set, that red zone skill set, that 11 on 11 for running backs, but it clouds a number of other issues about reading the field and how Lane Kiffin exploited half the field and not the full field. Hal from North Carolina, here's an evolution of a quarterback who had a tremendous subset of running backs and wide receivers in 2020, ran for 100 yards, nothing special. Last year, he ran for over 800 yards. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? And then finally, you have Desmond Ridder of Cincinnati, who put together a body of work that I equate to an Andy Dalton, who was certainly able to run at TCU and exploited offenses even in the Rose Bowl against Wisconsin. Desmond Ridder ran for almost 2,200 yards in his career, but is trying to develop into a passing quarterback. These are just examples of how the league is evolving. These guys are all going to be drafted in the first 2 days, and they're the future of the NFL, whether we're ready for it or not. And we have to analytic for it to find out whether or not the second most important player on your team is the backup quarterback now and not the left tackle or the cornerback or something else, because 18, 17 game season, we're going to see more than one quarterback per team in the NFL.
Ron, I got a question for you. Are they the future of the NFL, or are they just the best we have this year? Isn't that a fair question to ask?
The quarterback crop is not great this year, no matter how many draft analysts are going to build them up. But the skill sets that they have are not going away.
Right.
The evading the pocket with the intent of running. Splash plays by Justin Fields, they're going to continue. His rookie year was up and down, partly because of the team he played for.
Yes.
And he has to evolve. But Malik Willis and Justin Fields, they're going to make splash running plays. The question is, will it correlate to win success?
How about, are these guys being coached up in college enough to the older guys, not that old, just a few years ago? Are they being coached up to be pro quarterbacks early on, or do they have a giant learning curve?
Want to go for that one, Josiah?
Oh, we lost a video.
We lost your sound for
Audio.
a second there.
There we go. Sorry.
There you go.
I'm not a good college quarterback scout because I don't watch any college football. This analysis I've been talking about requires 100% of my attention during the and so I like when I look at rookie situations, I typically start with the situation, right? So I look at the surroundings, I look at the offensive line, I look at the coaching, and so last year it wasn't surprising to me, in hindsight, I wish I had seen it at the beginning, that Mac Jones was the best rookie quarterback because he had the best offensive line. He had the best coach. The coach was going to bring him along step by step without putting too much on his shoulders. Whereas, you look at poorly coached rookie quarterbacks and they typically fail because too much is thrown at them too quickly, or they have no offensive line. So they don't have time to process the defenses. And so, I wait until after the draft and then I see where the different quarterbacks go. And then I start looking at college tape. And I start to say, okay, how do they fit in with this offense, this coaching, this system? And so at this point, I'm like completely agnostic about the rookie quarterbacks. But after the draft, I'll start forming opinions.
That's perfect. I mean, you want to have a clean slate. You don't want to go in with biases and so on.
Right.
It really matters person-team fit. So any closing thoughts on this particular topic?
Well, I have one that I still believe, even though it's becoming really sort of history, I still believe there's an advantage to coming into the league, even though I know they want to pay them and you got to get your money's worth, but they should be sitting for at least a year and watching. And everybody's so impatient. It's a fast food society. I got to get my hamburger immediately. Aaron Rodgers told me 10 years ago, the luckiest thing that happened to him, and he hated it at the time, was sitting for 3 years behind Brett Favre. And that helped make him a ready quarterback the first day he played, which I was there that night. It was a Monday night game against Minnesota. He won at home. He had the worst Lambeau leap in the history of Lambeau Field, but it didn't matter because he won the game. And he said it should really be that way for everybody, but that's not being realistic.
I agree with Ted, and I'll add that if you're planning on playing a rookie quarterback day one and you don't have the weapons and the offensive line in place and you want to win in the short term, which is, you can argue about whether that's something you'll want, then I think you should go with a mobile quarterback, a run-first quarterback, because running quarterbacks are less dependent on the quality of the weapons they have, right? They are creating a lot of the yards themselves, and then because of that overcommitment on defense to the run, the receivers typically get single coverage. And most NFL receivers can win sometimes in single coverage, even if they're not elite. You don't need those elite route runners when you don't have, an elite pocket quarterback. So I would say a lot of it depends on the situation, and that's why you see teams like the Ravens not necessarily as focused on building out elite receiver talent, is because it's not necessary with Lamar Jackson. And
it really doesn't matter what we say, Ron, because by week 4 or 5, the backup's going to be in there anyway because of injury, and all of this means nothing. Go ahead.
Well, the Trey Lance experience is going to be interesting because he needed to sit. He didn't play because of COVID in 2020. The team didn't play, his college team. So he was brought along, and they resisted the temptation to play him more. And in the long run, his ability to read defenses, his ability to stay upright, I think I'm very pleased with how San Francisco handled that situation. And we'll see moving forward. So a couple of questions for you guys. We just had the NFL meetings. They had the rule change. We're not going to talk about the overtime rule change. Instead, let's start with you, Josiah. What rule change would you like to see in the NFL that isn't there right now?
This is a very minor one and will never happen. But it's always bothered me that when you're on the 1 yard line, penalties on the offense and defense are not they're not symmetrical. So if let's say you have 1st and goal on the 1 and you get a false start, you go back to the 6, but you have 1st and goal from the 1 and there's a defensive offsides, you move the ball forward like 4 inches. And so what I would love to see is a symmetry of penalties when you're close to the goal line, So it's half the distance to the goal and twice the distance from the goal. So if you get an offensive, a false start on first and goal from the 1, you go to the 2. So that's just like a minor thing that I think would balance out those kinds of situations. It makes it a little bit too beneficial to be on the side that's closest to the goal line. You can take more risks, and I don't think that's necessarily fair.
I like that. I never thought of that.
That's very good. Yeah, I got an issue with the taunting penalties. It's getting ridiculous now because if you look at somebody funny, you're going to prison for 10 years. And that's not. I mean, that's back to the no fun league again, and I don't like that. Let's have some fun here, guys. It's football. It's a game. People want to get into it. There's craziness out on the field. Ron used to be a Raiders fan in the old days when, they brought knives and guns onto the field. So, it didn't matter. It was a different world then. I don't want to go back to those days. But to me, if there was a time and a place where these guys can interact, they can yell in each other's face, that doesn't mean taunting. If you do something unprofessional, that's taunting. That should be 15 yards. And the next time you do it, you're tossed. I got no problem with that. As a matter of fact, I want that to be. I don't want guys just to take liberties because they're jerks. That's wrong. And this is a profession. This isn't out in the street. But at the same time, it's okay to yell at each other. It's okay to get in somebody's face and say, this, that, and that's okay to me. And I hate the taunting rule, at least the subjectivity of it, the way it's being called by the officials.
Okay. I like that too. Well, mine is basically the pass interference call. I happen to like the college rule where the most you could get is 15 yards. I think if you throw these passes and they're 50 yards and all of a sudden you're from the 25 to the other team's 25, that just seems like such a unfair advantage to go flip the field because somebody stumbled. I mean, sometimes you grab the guy in college because it's a 15-yard penalty. That's just part of the strategy. I'm okay with that being strategy. But why are we giving people 50 yards, 40 yards on penalties when we give somebody else, illegal contact of 5 yard or any of these other ones? It just changes the game, and it can be a subjective call at times that changes the games on a very large number of yards penalty.
I totally agree with you. The only issue is that the league wants offense so badly. I don't know if they'll ever turn that around because that's part of that's like, wow, look at all that. Look at how it could affect the game in the last drive. And I think the league loves that as opposed to what is actually fair. Yeah. That's the way I see it.
Well, money, viewership, and so on, but fairness and equality, a different story. Okay, one last question for you guys. It's a semi-gambling related question. We saw some places in faraway lands and maybe even a couple in some of the states post some win totals for the NFL. Now, 31 out of 32 teams generally have the win totals, but we don't know the Deshaun Watson situation. And a lot of people, most have not posted a Deshaun Watson win total. If I give you a hypothetical that Deshaun Watson sits for 6 games this year and he plays for 11 games, how would you go about setting a win total in that case? Let's also assume that Baker Mayfield is not on the team and the backup is, I think it's Jacoby Brissett. Josiah, where do you go if you get Deshaun Watson for 11 games and Jacoby for 6?
I mean, that's tough. Like, I think lining them around 10 is the right spot. 10 and a half. I haven't done a deep dive into their schedule yet, but I think the Browns are a really good roster outside of quarterback and receiver, and they addressed both in the offseason, assuming Deshaun Watson plays. So I think they're really well set up to be a complete team. They're good on defense. They've got good offensive line. They've got good coach. And I think Brissett is the right type of quarterback to replace Deshaun Watson in terms of skill set and style. Obviously, he's not as good as Deshaun Watson, but I think they can win games with Brissett just like they were able to win games with Mayfield. So I think a high win total, 10 and a half is the right range.
Yeah, I feel similar to that. I think Brissett can be sort of like a Teddy Bridgewater, sort of a bridge quarterback, if you don't mind me saying. I got no problem with him. I like him a lot, actually. I'm not so sure. I don't like win totals before I know the schedule. So, I mean, how do you put a real number on it? And I looked it up last night, and there were a few early numbers at 9.5 that I saw on Cleveland. And you know what? I still think that's pretty much fair. That was before, it had to be before that they acquired Watson. But let's say Watson plays 11 games. Is he really going to be like Sharp Clark at the beginning of the season? How sharp is he going to be, right? When's the last time he played a game? And I don't know if he's going to start the year or if he's going to come in the middle of the year. You know, how does that come into play? When does the league say, hey, this is going to happen? You know, that could change the dynamics of their season as well. All of a sudden, you got to bring in the backup in the middle of the year. I tend to doubt that would happen, but you never know, right? I mean, who knows what the league's going to do? They're different on every single time they want to throw a penalty flag at somebody. They have they're just making it up as they go along. So who knows? But to me, 9.5 is sort of fair. And you look at it, okay, if there are 6 games or 7 games that Brissett has to start, can he be 4-3 in those games, right? So there's 4 right there. And then the other 11, 7 wins, maybe 6, maybe for Watson. Now there's 10 games. So 9.5 for 10 is sort of a good number to be on. And you know what? I like their roster. But the first year, this little mix up here and who knows what's going to happen, that is never healthy for a team. So I would tend to lean towards the unders at 10.
Okay. So this is a bit of a trick question, that I gave you here, because to me, there are a lot of variables in terms of, how many points is Deshaun Watson worth versus Brissett. I would say the first 3 or 4 games that Deshaun Watson plays, 0 difference.
Yeah, exactly.
And you alluded to that. What is he going to look like? So in my mind, you get Brissett for 6 games. You get Brissett again for 3 or 4 because there's no difference. You're only getting an increase in terms of effectiveness, perhaps for only 6 or 7 games. And you haven't done a deep dive into the schedule, but we know that the AFC has 8 home games and not 9 home games like last year. So I would have erred closer to 9.5. But it really, when people look and say, if Aaron Rodgers is missing the next game, how much does the spread change? Well, it changes 7, 8, 9 points. Well, if Deshaun Watson misses game 6, and Brissett comes in, or let's say misses game 3 earlier in the season before he's had a chance to get his feet wet, is there any difference at that point? So these are some of the variables. You're right. We have to look at the schedule and see how it plays out. And we have no idea what the Deshaun Watson penalties are going to be this year, next year, and so on. But hypothetically, there's a lot to unpack in terms of how you go week to week and putting a number up right now. What if he plays the whole year? So
I doubt it.
It's a very interesting topic.
Give me 10. I'll take the unders and take my chance. Wouldn't be a big play, but I would still make the play on the U's.
Okay. Any final thoughts before we wrap this up?
Go ahead.
I just want to say how grateful I am that you guys brought me on, and I really appreciate the conversation. It's been a good time.
Great, I appreciate it. Yeah, this is fun. Let's do it more often, and I hope when Chris comes back, he'll have a spot in one of these little windows here, right?
Yeah, we'll give him a little window spot. I'm sure we're going to have a lot of analytical stuff. We'd love to have you on again as we get, once we get into training camps and so on. You see right on the screen where you could follow all of us, Sharp Clark NFL, Ted Sobel Sports. Ted has a book.
There it is.
He's, every player we talked about, he's interviewed.
And there's Aaron Rodgers on the cover of my book right there.
Yeah. He's right there, and hopefully
still in a Packers uniform too, which is unbelievable. But go ahead.
Yeah. And you can find me at Ron A Sports, and hopefully I'll have some draft information available pre and post that will, NFL's a 24/7 league, and that's why we're here providing information week to week. Thanks again, Josiah, for joining us, and that'll do it for this edition of the Inside Blitz.
Beautiful.